Okay, good morning, everybody. Today is August 12th, 2021, and this is the New Possibilities Hour, part of the Will Work for Food project, organized by Natalie Armstrong Motan in the spring of 2020. We bring the legal and ADR communities webinars every week on topics of great interest. And there's no charge for these great webinars. Rather, we ask people to contribute to a food bank if they like what they see. And our audiences have been extraordinarily generous in the year and a half that we've been doing these webinars. One of my favorite parts of the program every week is when we announce the running total of those contributions of which we are aware. It's a self-reporting system, and we appreciate when people let Natalie know. Jean, my friend, would you please let us know what the running total is of contributions so far?
Hi, Jeff and everybody. It's so good to see you. The total as of this morning is just shy of $155,000, 154,740. So we're $200 and some away from 155,000, which I'm sure I know will pass today. So that's fantastic.
I'm sure of it too, Jean, because we really have a different and extraordinary program this morning with our friend David Latt. Everybody on this call knows who David Latt is and has read about him, so we'll keep the introduction short. David is a lawyer turned writer, one of the most prominent legal journalists in the country. He publishes Original Jurisdiction, a newsletter on Substack about law and legal affairs. I'm a subscriber to David's newsletter on Substack, and I recommend it highly. It's great reading every week. David also writes for newspapers and magazines, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. Before David launched Original Jurisdiction, he founded Above the Law, one of the nation's most widely read legal news websites. Before David entered the media world, he worked as a federal prosecutor, a litigation associate at the Wachtell Lipton firm in New York City, and a law clerk for the Ninth Circuit. David, we're so happy to have you here to talk about your near-death experience with COVID-19. My friend, please tell us about the food bank that's important to you. Tell us your story. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I really appreciate your having me. Thank you, Natalie, for starting this great project, which I'm really honored to be a part of. My husband and son and I recently moved from Manhattan to the town of Summit, New Jersey. My husband and I are both originally from the New York suburbs, and so it's a homecoming of sorts. And so I was really glad to participate in Will Work for Food because I've connected with the Community Food Bank of New Jersey, which is our local food bank out here. And I really thank all of you for your support of them. I think that the issue of food insecurity has really, unfortunately, only grown more serious during the pandemic. And even if, well, we'll talk about this, even if things may be improving, perhaps we'll see, in terms of both the pandemic and the economy, it still is a very, very serious crisis. And so again, I'm really grateful to all of you for your support and also for, of course, creating this program. So it's really a pleasure to be here and share the story, my personal story of my own struggle with COVID-19. It is a little bit off the beaten path, perhaps, in terms of alternative dispute resolution, but I actually think there may be some ways in which it does relate to the work of ADR, which I can talk about near the end. But I'm going to speak very informally and really from the heart. I don't have a script or a speech, honestly, and I do want to leave a lot of time for questions. Jeff reminded me that we do end very promptly on the hour, so I'll be sure to finish my particular remarks well before the hour because I would love to hear from all of you and all of your experiences during these very strange last 16 months or so. So rewinding to February of 2020, last year, I was living in Manhattan at the time with my husband, Zach, who is also our lawyer, and our then 2-year-old son, Harlan. And everything was going very well. I was working at the time as a legal recruiter, a little bit of a detour from my career as a legal journalist and writer. And I was living, like, as I mentioned, I was living in Manhattan. My husband was working as a lawyer. Our son was enjoying the city, and everything was fairly good. I was in quite good health. I was going to the gym multiple times a week. I really had no particular health conditions other than occasional exercise-induced asthma, which really wasn't an issue for me. I would take an inhaler before I would exercise, and I hadn't had an asthma attack in years. I honestly could not remember the last time I had an asthma attack. And I was a fairly avid gym goer. I would go to the gym several times a week. I would often participate in fitness classes, high intensity interval training, and the like. I also would occasionally jog. I wouldn't call myself a runner at the time, but I guess I had been a runner. I completed the New York Marathon twice years ago, admittedly rather slow pace, but I did finish. And so again, things were good. I was healthy. I was doing well professionally. Our family was doing well. So as you'll recall, early last year, we started to hear reports of this novel coronavirus out of China. And also we were hearing reports from Europe. And at the time, I didn't really put much stock in it, or I wasn't really particularly concerned. I was looking back in my planner from 2020, and we had a dinner with some friends, I think on February 28th. We had some friends over for dinner because back then you would have people over to your house all the time. And I remember we were talking about this new coronavirus, and we had heard the reporting saying that for most people, it was really nothing worse than maybe a bout of the flu. And I remember telling my friends at the time, oh, that really doesn't sound so bad, the flu. Why are people getting so worked up over this thing? I think I said something like, well, you know, if I get the flu, I get the flu, fine. And then we'll move on. So again, I was not really particularly perturbed by this. So in early March, I was still going about my normal daily routine, as were we all. There were no shutdown or lockdown orders in place. And really, I think the messaging from public officials also wasn't telling anyone to particularly stay at home at the time. In fact, I think our mayor in New York, Bill de Blasio, was even telling people, oh, go about your normal business. And so we were. So I was going to the office, I was going to the gym, I was going out. And really, nothing was particularly amiss. The weekend of March 7 and 8 is when I started to feel a little under the weather. We went out to dinner in a very crowded restaurant with two friends. So Zach and I were with these two friends of ours, and again, it was a very cramped restaurant, and you know, it was an Asian restaurant. We were sharing food. It was all very, it was all a lot of fun. But at the end of the dinner, I felt a bit unwell, just extremely tired. We were going to grab a drink or two after dinner, but I just excused myself because I just felt really exhausted. So I parted ways with the three of them and just went home. The next day was Sunday, and I actually felt a lot better. And I even went to the gym that day. I felt generally fine until the evening rolled around again. And we went out to dinner with my in-laws who came in from New Jersey. And again, in the middle of the dinner, I was just suddenly hit by this incredible fatigue. The other thing that was odd was we went to one of our favorite neighborhood restaurants, and I remember the food all just tasting the same, namely not having any taste. And I just kind of thought, wow, I guess the kitchen is having an off night. This is very strange. At the time, it was not really widely reported that one common symptom of COVID was loss of taste and smell. So anyway, as I mentioned, I felt so tired during this dinner. I didn't have any other symptoms. I didn't have a fever or chills or anything, but I just was so out of sorts. It was really strange. So this time I excused myself mid-meal and just went home because I just was feeling so out of it. And then the next day, I felt, again, somewhat better. And again, I went about my routine. I even went into the office and worked a little bit. But again, by the time the afternoon and evening came around, I wasn't feeling well. And so I went home. And it was around Monday that I started to really start to feel more symptoms. I started to get a fever and aches and pains in addition to this incredible fatigue. I was actually that Tuesday, funnily enough, supposed to be having lunch with David Boies, the well-known litigator, founder of Boies Schiller. And fortunately, I canceled because I wasn't feeling well. I would not have wanted to get him ill because he's I think he's now almost around 80 probably. And I just stayed at home for the rest of the week because my symptoms were worsening. The fever, the chills, the fatigue, and things were not really getting better. At the time, it crossed my mind that, who knows, maybe I had this strange new coronavirus, but it seemed like a long shot to me because at the time in New York City, when I would go and look these things up, we had maybe 50 or so documented cases of COVID-19 in a city of 8 million. And so I thought to myself, what are the chances that I'm really one of these 50 or so who has this new disease? Of course, little did we know that there were far more than 50 of us who had it. And there may have been people, I certainly have friends or contacts who got sick in February or even January and later tested positive for antibodies. But again, I'm kind of situating things in terms of what we knew back then, what we knew at the time. So Thursday of this week, I woke up actually without a fever. And so I thought, wow, maybe I'm actually getting better. But then again, by the afternoon, I got a new symptom, which I hadn't had before, which was this terrible dry cough and a little bit of difficulty breathing. And that symptom persisted and worsened into Friday. And so on Friday, I called up my primary care doctor and I explained my symptoms, and I spoke over the phone with a nurse practitioner. And I mentioned the possibility that maybe I had COVID-19. And she said, no, I don't think so. That doesn't sound like it. She thought, well, maybe you had a case of the flu that turned into bronchitis. So she prescribed me some antibiotics, I think azithromycin, a Z-Pak, and some cough medicine. And she told me, oh, you should feel better fairly soon. So I filled a prescription that Friday and I started taking these medications, but I wasn't getting better. Saturday was worse than Friday and Sunday was worse than Saturday. And on Sunday, I reached the point where I was really having difficulty breathing. And it did remind me a little bit of when I would have asthma. I just was having a hard time. I kept on having to sort of clear my throat to try and breathe. I had my inhaler at home. I was taking it, but it didn't seem to be helping. So eventually I went to my, oh, and by the way, I should mention, my parents are doctors, and my mother, being both a doctor and a mom, she was very prone to worry, and she was much more concerned about my condition than I was. And she said, you really should seek some help. And I think she was a little skeptical of, just giving me antibiotics and a cough syrup. And so partly at her urging, I did go to my local emergency room at NYU Langone on that Sunday. And at the time, they heard all my symptoms. They ran some tests. I asked for a COVID-19 test, but they refused that to me. At the time, as you may recall, in mid-March, COVID-19 tests were in very short supply, and they were generally not giving them to people unless they had a particular reason to believe that maybe you had COVID. And so I didn't have a travel history. I had not been to China or Europe. I hadn't had any known contact with somebody with a confirmed case of COVID. So they basically said, look, we're not going to give you the test. They did give me a cold flu test at the time, which indicated that my symptoms were not caused by the cold or flu, but that test is not 100% effective. And so the doctor thought, you probably still have the flu. So they sent me home and told me essentially to take care of my symptoms at home and self-quarantine. So I did. I went back home. But Monday came around and I was in very bad shape at the time. But I was still resisting going to the hospital or returning to the hospital because I don't know, I just kind of thought, well, maybe I can just ride this out. But at that point, my husband, Zach, was really worried. And he said, look, if you're not going to go to the hospital, I will call 911 and you can be carried out of here. And not wanting to make a scene or inconvenience anyone, I said, okay, fine, I'll go to the hospital. And I remember as I was just even trying to get ready, it was a struggle. I was sitting on the edge of my bed, catching my breath. And then I kind of moved to the dining table and I sat down there and caught my breath. And our apartment in New York is a standard New York apartment. It's not particularly big. These are not great distances I'm traversing. Then I went from the dining table to the edge of the living room couch and I had to catch my breath. And then even just going to the side table by our front door to put on my mask and my gloves, that was already a struggle. But somehow I made it out the door. I took a cab over there because there was no way I could walk. I tried to breathe as little as possible during the cab ride. And of course, I had my mask and my gloves. And I remember by the time I got to the emergency room, I was really having difficulty breathing. There's a counter, an intake counter. And I remember I was having to prop myself up on my hands and arms because I was having difficulty standing at that point. And when they asked what my issue was, I just said, I can't breathe. So they took me back into the emergency room very quickly. They asked a couple of quick questions about my symptoms, and then they brought me back. And I don't know what my oxygen level was at the time, but they immediately connected me with supplemental oxygen, which was a great relief. Just having the oxygen, it made me feel so much better. I just felt so much more secure. I felt I was able to breathe a little bit again. So the emergency room was like a big open space. And so, there was a curtain in front of me, but I could hear the doctors conferring. And I heard one of the doctors tell another, oh, I think this patient has COVID-19. So they moved me within the emergency room into an isolation room, separated from the rest of the ER. And this was a so-called negative pressure room where the air pressure in the room is different from the air pressure outside, such that any air, sorry, I think there's a car alarm going off. I don't know if that's my car alarm. Oh, thankfully it stopped. So they put me in this negative pressure room, and which meant that any air that perhaps I was contaminating in this room, and I was wearing a mask, of course, but still, was not going out to the rest of the ER. And at that time, they did give me a COVID test. I was still getting the supplemental oxygen. They moved me up to a room. They admitted me. And then that evening, a doctor came by and told me that, not to my surprise at this point, I had tested positive for COVID-19. So the next few days were fine, I guess. I was in stable condition. I wasn't really getting any better or any worse. It was tough though, because as you'll recall, because COVID is so transmissible, you were not allowed visitors. So I was in the hospital alone. I couldn't see my husband or son or parents. Nobody could come visit. Thank God for technology. I wasn't really using Zoom at the time, but I had FaceTime, so I could FaceTime with them. And I felt very fortunate to have my parents, doctors there, because they were really able to advocate for me. And whenever the doctors would come into the room to confer and to tell me about treatments, I would put them on speakerphone and my parents could talk to them. What was scary at the time was we knew so much less about treating COVID then that we know now. And so, for example, based on what they were reading, my parents were pushing for me to receive hydroxychloroquine. And the doctors also thought that that would be a good idea based on the early research. And now, of course, we know that it does not seem to be particularly helpful. But I did get hydroxychloroquine. I also received an antiviral called Kaletra, which is really an HIV medication, but there was some early reports out of China that maybe this was helpful. So I was getting those medications in my first few days at the hospital. And so I was fairly stable until that Friday. I'd been admitted that Monday, by the way, so this was a few days later. And Friday night going into Saturday, I took a turn for the worse. My oxygen levels plummeted. And sometime between, I think, midnight and 3 a.m., someone came into my room. I can't remember who, whether it was a doctor or a nurse, and basically told me, your oxygen levels are dropping. We're going to have to intubate you or put you on a ventilator. So as you may also recall at the time, ventilators were being used to help people who could not breathe on their own. You're essentially hooked up to this machine that performs your breathing functions for you. And they were, on the one hand, these very life-saving machines, and people were worried about there even being a shortage of ventilators. On the other hand, people were very nervous because the early research suggested that survival rates of people on ventilators were not particularly high. And in fact, I remember my dad, who, he's a wonderful person, but he tends to be a bit of a pessimist. And he also can be like a little bit of a Debbie Downer. I remember him telling me when I first got admitted to the hospital, well, whatever you do, don't get put on a ventilator, as if that was somehow within my control. Thanks, Dad. But he did tell me that. And so when I was told I had to be put on a ventilator that Friday, I was terrified. It was really the most frightening moment of my life. And I, again, they did not, nowadays, I think before they put someone on a ventilator, sometimes they'll give the person time to call their friends or their family. But they did, at the time, I was just pretty much immediately put on this machine. They told me it was medically necessary. I think they asked me sort of pro forma, do you consent to this? I said, of course. They asked me a number of other questions, which did not seem particularly encouraging, like, are you willing to be an organ donor? Yes. Are you willing do you wish to be resuscitated if necessary? And I said yes to that. It's interesting, I have heard from others who have been in that situation who have said, no, I don't wish to be resuscitated. I've even heard from people who said, I don't even want to be put on a ventilator. But for me at the time, I was 44 years old. I had a family, a husband, a son. I was willing to have whatever measures taken to save my life taken. So I answered yes to that question too. So I remember they were hooking me up to this, getting me ready to be put on this ventilator. And it's a very unpleasant process. I mean, I remember being hooked up to a catheter because, you can't control your bodily functions. They hooked up an IV and they started giving me anesthesia. And I remember it was just this whirl of activity. It felt like there were a dozen people in the room, even though there were probably just a handful. And at a certain point, I just passed out. I don't really recall the moment of being put on the ventilator, which is not a particularly pleasant one, which is why they give you so much in the way of drugs, because they take a tube and it essentially goes down your throat. And it is not a good thing. It damages your vocal cords, for instance. And so I don't recall that. I do remember before being put on the ventilator, I was just praying. I'm Catholic. I was just praying the Hail Mary over and over again. I didn't really know what else to do. I remember having the weird fleeting thought that, wow, kind of like on the upside, I'll finally find out like this great, this question that all these philosophers and theologians have wondered about, like, is there an afterlife? I thought, wow, well, maybe I'll find out. But that was really the only good thing I could think about in terms of what I was about to experience. And I don't even know if that was a particularly good thing. But anyway, there were all these crazy thoughts just running through my head as this process was underway. So I was put on this ventilator and I don't remember anything from that time. Some people ask me, oh, did you have any hallucinations or any recollections? And I remember nothing. It's basically like an entire week of my life was just removed, like as if you were recording and there was just a blank on the tape. Anything that happened that week, to me, it was as if it never happened. But thank God, thanks to the wonderful care I received and the doctors and nurses and other healthcare professionals at NYU Langone, I did pull through. I did come off the ventilator. Again, I don't remember the moment of coming off the ventilator. It was all sort of hazy. And I think probably my earliest memories are being back in a hospital bed, and again, texting with my family to kind of tell them, I'm okay. I remember I was texting with my dad, and I usually have very impeccably punctuated and correctly spelled texts. But I was in such a haze at the time from all the drugs that were still in the process of wearing off that I think he texted me something like, "How are you feeling? Are you okay?" And I typed back something like, "Okay, but breathing." And then there were about 20 random emojis after that, including like thread emojis and cooking emojis and all these emojis I never use. And I don't know if I could ever find them if I had to again. But I was just in quite a state. I was just totally out of it. So after I came off the ventilator, my voice was shot, by the way, because of what it does to your vocal cords. I remember talking to one of the doctors and he said, you're one of the fortunate ones. You came off this ventilator. And he said that there are many other people or a number of other people who were put on ventilators before you who are still on the ventilator. In terms of trying to figure out when to get you off the ventilator, what they essentially do is they kind of stop the machine very briefly and see if you can, the extent to which you can breathe on your own. And if you can't, they basically turn it back on. And if you can, and they look at other markers and indicators as well, then they can try and take you off it. So they figured out correctly that I guess after about 6 days or so, I could be taken off this ventilator. So I was taken off the ventilator, but I was still in very bad shape. I was getting supplemental oxygen at the highest level, I think 7 liters or something like that. And I was moved at some point from a private room in the ICU because I had been in the intensive care unit in critical condition down to a room that I shared with 3 other patients. And I should mention, by the way, that my time on the ventilator, to me, I mean, obviously, while it was terrible, I don't remember any of it. It was a much more awful experience in some ways for my husband and my parents because they couldn't come in and see me. They were just waiting at home, waiting by the phone for that once-a-day call from the doctors or nurses to tell them my state. And at the time, by this point, the hospital was overwhelmed. I was one of, I think, the first 10 or so patients admitted to NYU Langone with COVID. And by the time I checked out 2.5 weeks later, they had 7 to 8 floors of coronavirus patients. This was really just as that first peak was sort of ramping up. So that they were overwhelmed. And that's why they would call about once a day, because it was really hard for them to do more. And again, for a while, to my parents, to my husband, it seemed I was very touch and go. And they never really gave sort of an estimate of my chances of surviving. But Zach, my husband, got the sense that maybe it was 50-50 or something, that it was like a coin flip. One thing they did do while I was on the ventilator, with the permission of Zach, who had my healthcare proxy, and by the way, if I can have a little PSA, public service message, if you don't have those things set up already, I urge you to. I mean, certainly a healthcare proxy, directives about who you want to make decisions about your health if you are incapacitated, certainly other planning documents like a will. But anyway, Zach had my proxy and he agreed on my behalf to have me given this experimental drug called clazakizumab. It was an IL-6 inhibitor, which essentially calms down your immune system. What I was experiencing, I think, was the so-called cytokine storm, where your body turns on itself. The immune system is supposed to repel invaders like the coronavirus, but in my case, it was kind of going haywire and attacking my own body. And part of this might have also been maybe having to do with my asthma history. Perhaps my body was primed to react this way to illness, but it was an extreme overreaction. So I did get this IL-6 inhibitor, which may have helped, although it's not clear. The research on the IL-6 inhibitors, I think, is still a little inconclusive. And by the way, there were some of the other treatments that have now been proven fairly effective in randomized double-blind studies. Again, we're not being used in early or mid-March. So no monoclonal antibodies, no steroids, no dexamethasone, nothing like that. They were just trying all these different things. I mean, essentially they were throwing things against a wall and seeing what stuck. And again, in my case, I was very, very lucky because, something worked. So I then was back in a regular hospital room with 3 other people who had COVID. And one thing I should also add here is, because COVID is so contagious, the doctors and nurses would not come in very often. When they would come in, they would sort of try to bunch everything. Like they would try to check your vitals, give you your meds, tell you what was next in terms of your treatment. They tried to do everything all at once as much as possible. Because each time they came in, they had to don a new set of personal protective equipment or PPE. They had to scrub in and wash their hands for half a minute. When they would leave, they would have to scrub out. There was a trash can right outside the room, and they would take off the PPE they had just had and throw it in the trash can. And we were lucky. NYU Langone is a very advanced and very wealthy hospital. The Langone is Ken Langone, one of the founders of Home Depot, who I think is a billionaire and has given tons of money to the hospital. They had ample PPE. As you'll remember, there were other hospitals at the time that had shortages. And there are hospitals, I think, today that still struggle under shortages of these supplies. But we were very fortunate at NYU to have lots of personal protective equipment, and even lots of oxygen. As I mentioned, I was receiving supplemental oxygen at the highest levels. And we have to remember, COVID is not just an American problem; it's a global health crisis. And in India, for example, which has been particularly hard hit, India may eventually surpass us in terms of the country with the most COVID deaths, I think. They've had shortages of oxygen, actually. So I was basically like, all you can breathe oxygen. But that was not the case, or is not the case for many throughout the world. So again, I was in the hospital. I was getting oxygen at the highest level. But what they would do during this period was they would gradually reduce the oxygen a little bit each day to see how it would function on the lower levels of oxygen. And they would watch my oxygen. So again, if I have another piece of advice, if you don't already have one, maybe consider getting a pulse oximeter, which is this little device you can hook up to your finger, and it tells you your heart rate and it tells you your oxygen. And what they have been doing during the pandemic is, for people who are watching their symptoms at home, you can hook this device up to yourself and put it on your finger, and you can see what your oxygen level is. Because sometimes your subjective experience of breathing or oxygen intake isn't an accurate indicator of what you actually have in terms of your oxygen level. And if your oxygen level drops below, say, 90, that's usually a sign that you should get yourself to the hospital. So they were monitoring my oxygen. And as they took down the supplemental oxygen, as they sort of tapered that, they would see if I could still keep my oxygen above 90. And fortunately, I generally was able to do so. So they started gradually lowering it from 7 to 6.5 to 6. So that was what was going on at the time. And I was starting to get a little bit more with it. And one thing I should also mention here is, and perhaps this is why my COVID story became more well-known, during this whole period, I was essentially live tweeting my COVID experience. When I first got admitted to the hospital on March 16, I wanted to find a way to let all of my contacts know that I had COVID, and if they got symptoms, they should get tested, and they could cite me as the confirmed case to try and get a test saying, look, I did have interaction with this person, David, who had COVID. And so I thought, well, what's the easiest way to do that? And I thought, well, social media. So I went on Twitter, where I think maybe at the time I had around 33,000 followers. I went on Facebook, where I had, like several thousand friends, and I just posted and said, look, I have COVID. I'm very sorry if I unwittingly got you infected. And I did actually get people infected, it seems. My husband, Zach, got it. Fortunately for him, it was really just like 2 weeks of the flu. Those two friends we had dinner with that night, actually a federal judge and his husband, they got it, probably from me, I'm guessing. Fortunately, they're fine. One of my colleagues at work, that Monday I went into the office, he got COVID. I don't know that he got it from me, but it's quite possible. He ended up being hospitalized too. Fortunately, he was fine. But, I wonder, in terms of just the chain of infection, like, I wonder, and, I fear, like, I wonder who else I got sick and whether any of those people, may have died. I mean, I just don't know. We don't, they have contact tracing, but it was not really adequate. It was not really being, thoroughly done. So, again, I pray I didn't, but I just don't know, because I also didn't know I was sick at the time. And in early March, we weren't really, I think the risk of having COVID was underestimated. And so I was going about my regular routine. I mentioned, I went to the gym. I had dinner with my in-laws. Thank God they never got it. I went to the office. 2 of my coworkers got it. And then, thankfully, I realized I'm going to stay home. But, again, this is how a disease spreads. But anyway, so I'm back to my recovery. Sorry if I'm jumping around a little bit. I haven't told the story I mean, I've told bits and pieces of the story, but I haven't sort of told it in this one coherent way. So sometimes I jump around a bit. I mentioned I live tweeted, or I mentioned my diagnosis on Facebook, and I got such an outpouring of just love and support and good wishes that I thought to myself, you know what, why don't I just continue doing this? Part of it also was, I think it was of a piece with what I've done professionally, just as a writer and a blogger. I've often taken somewhat opaque institutions like the federal judiciary or the world of large law firms, and I've tried to make them more transparent to the outside world through my writing on Above the Law, on Original Jurisdiction. And writing about COVID and my COVID experience on social media was in some ways very consistent with that. It was taking something that was poorly understood and that was a bit shrouded in mystery, but nevertheless very important, and trying to bring some transparency to it and trying to inform people, and also trying to inform people of the seriousness of this. I was a relatively young person, 44, a former marathon runner, going to the gym multiple times a week, no underlying health conditions except for this asthma. And I couldn't remember the last time I had an attack. It was very well managed asthma, as they say. And I wound up on a ventilator, and I wound up in the hospital for almost 3 weeks. And so I was writing about this on social media, and it was funny, as I was coming to, and as I was recovering post-ventilator, my husband, Zach, was updating me on social media. And he said, by the way, like, you're all over social media. You're getting like good wishes from everyone from like Cher, Kathy Griffin, Susan Rice. He was like, oh, it's very bipartisan. Like everyone from like Chris Christie and Ted Cruz to, like Preet Bharara and like some Democratic Congress people. Like it was very, I wasn't paying attention to this. I was just trying to breathe. But I would occasionally go on. I'd be like, oh, like, wow, Cher tweeted at me. That's pretty cool. But anyway, what was good about all of this interaction on social media was my particular account, amplified by all of these famous people, was getting out. And I was able to both explain the seriousness of COVID, including to a young and relatively healthy person. I was also able to, I think, share, what I went through, the challenges, my appreciation for all of the doctors and nurses and nurse practitioners and respiratory therapists, and even a speech pathologist who came by my room to sort of just kind of check on my swallowing, which would be an indicator of whether I could talk again. All of that I got to do over social media. One thing that did happen over the course of this is my social media following did increase, probably tripled from like 33,000 to 99,000 or so. Partly it was because people were trying to see like what, was going to happen to me. And each time I had a positive development, I just, got a wonderful outpouring of support. For example, when I would get to successively lower levels of oxygen, or when I finally came off the oxygen entirely, I just got a wonderful outpouring of support. And also, for those of you who, are religious, like prayers, I got tons of prayers. My mother, of course, she's a doctor. She's very much a woman of science, but she's also, a very spiritual woman. And she had people praying for me all over the world. My family's originally from the Philippines. There were people praying in the Philippines. There were people praying in Thailand, where I have an aunt. There were people praying in India. People all over the world were just praying for me to pull through. And those who were not religious were sending equivalents of that. And so I really felt so embraced and supported by so many different communities, whether it was the legal community, the LGBT community, the Asian American community, but also complete strangers and people I had nothing in common with were connecting with me over social media. People were asking me for advice, not that I really, had much advice to give, really. It was just my particular experience. But I was hearing from other people whose families or loved ones were suffering from COVID. So it really was nice to have this kind of connection during a time of such great difficulty for me and my family. So eventually, thankfully, I did get taken off the supplemental oxygen, and I was able to breathe so-called room air, meaning you're just, breathing normally. And they wanted to get me on room air before discharging me. Sometimes people go home with oxygen, but that's really not recommended. You have this giant oxygen tank, it's huge. it's flammable. Like it's not really, some people need oxygen at home just, because they have a certain condition, but they were trying to not send me home with oxygen. The other thing they had me do before they sent me home was this test really was for you to walk across your hospital room and back. And I was able to do it, but with great, great difficulty. And this was, I was someone who, again, I had run the marathon before. Even though I was no longer really running at the time I got sick, I had this sort of resolution of trying to cover at least 25 miles, either walking or running per week. I had my little, I check on my little iPhone health app. But here it was a struggle to like cross the room. But by that point, I was ready to check out. Like I received great care from everyone there. I mean, they saved my life. But the hospital's not a particularly fun place. Like even a very nice hospital like NYU, you do want to get out of there at some point. I mentioned I shared a room with 3 other people, and some of those beds had already turned over. The people had left. There were new people in them. So I was eager to go home. So finally, I remember the date because it was April Fool's Day, April 1, I got discharged. This was about 2.5 weeks after I'd first been admitted. And I was still very weak. My husband and his parents picked me up, and I sat in the way back of their, minivan basically. And I had this mask on still because we were still very scared about whether we could perhaps give it to people. The doctors I saw while I was at the hospital sort of privately told me, you've been sick for so long, you probably A, have an immunity, and B, are probably unlikely to pass it. But nobody was really willing to sort of state that publicly. There was still so much we didn't know and still don't know about how it's transmitted. So we were still taking all the precautions. So they drove me to my parents' house. We were going to spend that period sort of convalescing at my parents. My parents are doctors, and they have like a little mini, they have a lot of medical equipment at their house. That was helpful. They had a pulse oximeter, which we didn't have. They had a wheelchair because I had to go around on a wheelchair initially. I was too weak to really walk on my own. They could get supplemental oxygen if needed, and they knew how to administer it, being doctors. So we, again, and their house is big, so we could basically stay in one side of it and not, be very, very socially distant from them. And when we would have our meals, they would not have their meals. I mean, we were trying to be cautious, but it was still scary because the last thing I wanted to do was give this to my parents. And it was a tough period. Like I said, I couldn't really walk. It was wonderful to be home though. I mean, to see my son again, to see my parents, my husband. I mean, that was such a great relief after this near-death experience. But it was very difficult those first few weeks. I still had a terrible cough. I still had shortness of breath. I couldn't cross a room without stopping for breath. I couldn't really walk up a flight of stairs without stopping to catch my breath. One of the first things I did when I got home was take a shower because, I hadn't showered actually for 2.5 weeks and I felt really disgusting. And I couldn't stand in the shower. I had to put a little plastic stool in there because at first I just sat down on the floor like I was going to take a bath. And then I came up with the idea of getting a little plastic stool to sit there because I couldn't stand. I just was so weak. And then started my slow period of recovery. For 2 months, I felt things weren't really getting better. I had cough, shortness of breath. I was just so weak. And this is what they refer to as long COVID. If you have these lingering symptoms for 6 weeks or more, and I certainly did. My voice was also not completely back. It was really shot from being on the ventilator. So I would often write things down, or even if I was in the same room as somebody, I would just text them because I was trying to spare my voice. But thankfully, I slowly did recover. At some point in June of last year, the cough and the shortness of breath in a fairly short period of time went away. It was very weird because for 2 months, May and June, I felt I was making, actually April and May and June, for 3 months, I felt I was making hardly any progress. And then in the span of a couple of days in June, that went away. But again, I was still not my former self. I couldn't really walk a long distance. I couldn't really run. I was just still, very weak. My voice was still, it took probably 6 months for my voice to get back to normal. So I gradually did get better. In September, I trained for a so-called virtual 1 mile. New York Road Runners, which is a great organization, they have these races. They weren't doing them in person, obviously, during COVID, but they had this virtual 1 mile where basically you would take, your own time using this app and then, enter it. And so I had to train for that, to run 1 mile in September. I had to build up to that and walk a quarter mile, a half mile, just gradually building up my walking and then building up my running. And then in September, I was able to run that 1 mile, but it had taken me weeks of training to get there. And that 1 mile felt like the last mile of a marathon to me. Like it was just so difficult. But I continued to improve. In October, again, feeling fairly safe because, I did have antibodies. I did start returning to the gym, which of course was very low capacity, everyone wearing masks and hardly anybody there. But I did start working with a trainer to try and build my strength back because I also had lost so much muscle in the hospital. I had lost about 15 pounds when I was in the hospital, most of it muscle. And when I left the hospital, I was just emaciated. And then, being so glad to be alive for the next couple of weeks when I was at home, I just kind of, ate whatever I wanted. And then I gained back all the 15 pounds and then some. So by the time October rolled around, I was not in very good shape. So I decided, okay, you know what, I'm going to try and exercise and improve my eating and start working out with this trainer. So I did that and I gradually got better and better. But I still had this one lingering symptom. Even though my breath was fine, just on a day-to-day level, whenever I started to exert myself a little bit, I would get this shortness of breath and my heart rate would go really high, tachycardia. I just had an abnormally high heart rate. So I started seeing a pulmonologist and a cardiologist. Actually, I'd seen the pulmonologist pretty much ever since getting out of the hospital. I also started seeing a cardiologist. And, they, over the course of my seeing them, just with exercise and the passage of time, these things did improve. And eventually, a few weeks ago, earlier this year, both the pulmonologist and the cardiologist said, look, you're not quite back to normal, but you don't need to come back to see us. Just continue to exercise, continue to take care of yourself, and you should be fine. The cardiologist was thinking of putting me on beta blockers, which would lower my heart rate during exercise. But in the end, she said, you know what, if you don't need the drugs and it's getting better, just let it continue to get better. So here I am now, I guess, however many months, 16, 17 months after that experience. And, I guess a couple of things. I mean, I feel fairly recovered. I'm not back to my old self, but I feel very grateful to mostly be back to my old self, because as I mentioned, there are millions out there who struggle with so-called long COVID, these lingering symptoms. And that's why I think you can't even just say, well, let's just look at the 600,000 plus people who have died of COVID. You also have to think about all the others who are living with these lingering and long-term health impairments. It's not just, oh, well, it's like the flu and then you're, back to normal. I mean, there are a lot of people out there who are still suffering. So I feel very fortunate to be, mostly back to myself. But one thing that I did take away from this experience, besides just a great gratitude for all the support and the great healthcare and just a new appreciation for life, is, I did come to some realizations about myself. I mean, I realized that even though I enjoyed my work as a legal recruiter, I didn't really love it, not in the same way that I loved writing. And so I did return to writing, which is when I launched this new newsletter website on the Substack platform called Original Jurisdiction, which is now how I make my living. It's a subscription well, there's a mix of free stuff and subscription-based stuff. And so readers pay a small amount a month and subscribe. And so that's how I make my living now. I'm no longer working in recruiting. That was one change, because I just realized that, what was really important to me. And maybe that, I think, is one thing that probably ADR folks can relate to. I think a lot of times in a negotiation, you kind of have to figure out what's most important to each party. And maybe maybe that thing is not the same, such that, one party can get that thing and another party can get something else that's important to them. Like, I think for me, I just realized what was important to me, and that kind of professional enjoyment was more important to me than, maybe money, because recruiting was much more lucrative than writing. But having moved full-time back into writing in May of this year, I have, so far I have no regrets, even if it's not as remunerative as recruiting. The other thing we came to realize was, we wanted to leave the city. Again, I love New York City. I always will. I was born in the city. I spent most of my adult life there. But Zach and I, as I mentioned, we grew up in the suburbs. We'd often thought about returning to New Jersey. Our parents all live out here, all four of them. They give us a huge amount of help with our son, who's now almost 4. And so that was another life change. And the weird thing about my COVID experience was it kind of did give me the courage to sort of change these things. It sort of made me realize, you're really in charge of your own life. And certainly some things happen to you, like disease. But But, life is short, but we have the ability to change certain things, and including the things that we're frustrated by or not entirely satisfied by. And much as I loved living in New York City for 13 years, it was time to make a change. So we moved out to the suburbs. We have much more space out here. It seems like it's going to be a great place to raise our son. So that was another big life change. Anyway, I've rambled on longer than I intended to, and I see we have just 10 minutes left, but I would really like to just open the floor up to questions. And again, I thank all of you for tuning in. I know you're very, very busy, so I appreciate all of you joining us. And again, I also appreciate all of you who have supported, my local food bank and all the other food banks that have participated in this series. So again, thank you.
David, thank you so much. What an extraordinary tale of what you've been through and your candor with us. I think we've created quite an incredible time capsule here this morning, and your courage in dealing with all of these extraordinary challenges and coming through with such grace. It's just an extraordinary tale, and we thank you for sharing all that with us. And I know that the Community Food Bank of New Jersey, cfbnj.org, is going to benefit as well. We have a manageable size audience. I'm sure there are some questions. If anyone has a question, please feel comfortable either putting it in the chat or unmuting yourself and simply asking your question as you wish.
Well, I'll start. Hi. I remember reading about you being in the hospital and at least what was being reported with your parents and your husband and all that. I'm so glad that you're here today to tell us your story, and hope whatever long-term care, long-term effects end up going away. So thank you.
Can I ask a question? What will you recall to your young son? What story will you tell him, and how will you tell this story so that it's a learning moment for him and not something that will scare him? How do you communicate with a child about this?
That's a great question, Natalie. And it was really interesting how we had to communicate this around him. We were very lucky, by the way, I should say, because when we started to get sick, before we knew it was COVID, but when we started to get sick, we thought, you know what, on the chance that it's COVID, or even if it's just the flu, we were really just not in good shape. So we actually sent our son to go stay with my parents for a while, sort of in the country, in the suburbs. And this also allowed us to not have our nanny come because, she's a bit older. We didn't want to get her sick either. We didn't know at the time that it was COVID, because then we might have worried that maybe we were giving it to our son who would give it to my parents. But luckily, he went with my parents and was there for much of my hospitalization. And, they never got COVID and he never showed symptoms, but we wonder whether he got it back then, because he was with us all the time. And you know how it is, those of you who have kids, like your bodily fluids, their bodily fluid, like you're just all up in each other's business. Like you don't social distance from your, 3-year-old who you're taking care of. Or 2-year-old at the time. So, it was just, it was just crazy, but we were very lucky to have him there. When I was sick, we just kind of said, Papa, I go by Papa, Zach is daddy. Papa is sick. Papa's in the hospital. And he does, this is like, what it means to be a kid in the pandemic. Like our son can pronounce the word coronavirus. Like he knows what it is. He gets the sense that it's sick. But, he was very happy when I came home, but we've not really given him all the details. When he's older, I think, kind of like what Jeff was alluding to, there is this kind of time capsule or this record, because I do have all of this information that I've put out there, like my social media feed, articles. And I really want him to see it as a positive tale, just of one of just all the support that I got from so many people and places, because it really is, a heartwarming story. But again, I don't want to forget, all of the people who've been lost. I see a question in the chat about, losing family members or friends to COVID. And I did. I had a friend who I had seen for dinner, past November, Steve Sussman of the Sussman Godfrey law firm. He had a terrible cycling accident. He was starting to recover from that, but he got COVID while in the recovery facility and he passed away from it. I had 2 uncles in the Philippines who passed away from it. I mean, gosh, I had an uncle who was hospitalized, a cousin who was hospitalized, many others who got it but weren't hospitalized. So, there have been so many people who have been touched by this. I'm sure I'm leaving people out, but that's just what I remember.
I appreciate the point that you made, that it's difficult, of course, for the patients, but it's also really difficult for the family and the friends who lose that connectivity. And for those of us who have had to attend a funeral on Zoom, it's heartbreaking. And it takes extra effort to be supportive of those family members and those friendship circles. So it is one of those diseases that is not just the patient. It really is an entire family, an entire community, an entire office, an entire industry. So thank you so much for sharing your story. I really appreciate your time today.
I think there's a question from Stuart.
I think there's a question from Elon. Have your antibodies levels waned? Do you get tested? What do you do? What's your health protocol now?
Yeah.
Yes, I did get vaccinated March 1 and March 22, Pfizer. And my antibody levels, interestingly enough, I've been taking antibody tests. Right before I got vaccinated, I had a very low but still positive number of antibodies. It turned out those were antibodies for my original infection, which I had more than a year later. There's actually a Times article sort of about this that discusses it, because it was testing for different antibodies. They're the spike protein antibodies, they're nucleocapsid antibodies. The vaccines basically stimulate one, the natural infection works on another, or you can also have a test for the spike protein. I think it's less common. But anyway, I did have antibodies even before I got vaccinated. Now, knock on wood, my antibodies are even higher now. But, like many, especially with the rise of the Delta variant, I still take precautions. I don't go out that much. I wear a mask because even though I should have robust immunity as somebody who had natural infection and then got vaccinated, there are studies on this. Again, I don't want to take any chances.
David, there's a question from Mary Panisi. How do you feel about the city's attempt to reopen and return to work in person? Any tips for overcoming re-entry anxiety after experiencing loss and sickness?
I am so on the fence about this. I mean, generally, or before this, I was very in favor of reopening, because despite the harrowing experience I had with COVID, it has consequences, economic consequences, unemployment, which leads to food insecurity. I want us to reopen safely, but now that things are picking up again, I'm very torn about it. And, I guess I defer to the public health experts on this. I'm really, really torn on it. My personal opinion is employers should require vaccination. I'm not an employment lawyer, but it just seems to me like, and look, you can have exemptions, maybe religious, medical, whatever, but I don't really see the problem in requiring vaccination. And the court opinions on this seem to suggest that it is permissible so far. Oh, by the way, hi, Mary. Mary is somebody I knew before this whole ordeal. And then in terms of the reentry anxiety, that I don't have a good answer to that. I guess I would just say, don't be afraid to reach out for help. I mean, in addition to my cardiologist, my pulmonologist, I've had a wonderful therapist, psychiatrist. I think we should, we're all very vulnerable in this period. There's no shame in talking about your mental health struggles. I've experienced a lot of anxiety and depression since then, and I'm not afraid to get help for it, whether it's, professionally or from family and friends. So, definitely get help if you need it.
David, thank you so much. We're just about out of time. We've all been praying for your recovery when you were ill, and we're so happy to see that you've returned to robust, good health, and your candor and your humanity just shines through in this conversation. Thank you so much. We hope that people will support the Community Food Bank of New Jersey, cfbnj.org. And if you're comfortable informing Natalie, please do that so we can add it to our running total. David, you're a superstar. Thank you so much. And with that, we are complete.
Hey, thank you.
you.